Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
This is a lecture about worldview. Every person in this audience has his or her own experiences, and out of them forms a worldview. A carefully thought out worldview reflects the deep hunger among human beings for an overarching framework to bring unity to their lives. Now, how does my own research relate to our topic tonight? Well, this is a paper that I published about 35 years ago in the scientific journal Nature, which I'm sure all your science faculty will be familiar with. And it's our first paper on interstellar molecules. We published many papers on this topic in the Astrophysical Journal and elsewhere. So this is a bit related to what I want to address this evening. My topic is cosmology. What is it? Cosmology is the study of the universe as a whole, its structure, origin, and development. The questions cosmology addresses are profound, both scientifically and philosophically. And let's share a few of the questions. I think the questions define the field perhaps better than we could with a few sentences. Question number one, is the universe finite or infinite in content and extent? Number two, is the universe eternal or did it have a beginning? We'll spend quite a bit of time on that question. Was the universe created? If the universe was not created, how did it get here? If the universe was created, how was this creation accomplished? And what can we learn about the agent and events of creation? Who or what governs the laws and constants of physics? Are these laws the products of chance or something more profound? How do these laws relate to the support and development of life? Is there any existence, knowable existence, beyond the observed dimensions of the universe? And finally, is the universe running down irreversibly or will it bounce back? I do have an answer to the last question. You'll have to bear with me for the others. The idea that the universe had a specific time of origin has been philosophically resisted by some very distinguished scientists. For example, Arthur Eddington, who experimentally confirmed Einstein's general theory of relativity in 1919, stated this a dozen years later. Philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole. Albert Einstein's reaction to the consequences of his own general theory of relativity appeared to acknowledge the threat of an encounter with God. Through the equations of general relativity, we can trace the development of the universe backward to its origin. However, before publishing his cosmological inferences, Einstein introduced a cosmological fudge constant, the cosmological constant, to yield a static model for the universe, a universe that had always been here. Einstein dreamed of a universe that was infinitely old. In fairness, Einstein later considered this the great blunder of his scientific career, and he ultimately gave grudging acceptance to what he called, and I'll quote him directly so there can be no confusion, what he called the necessity for beginning, and later yet to what he called the presence of a superior reasoning power. But he never did accept the reality of a personal God, a God who cares about human beings. This is a subject that's been talked about for a long time. More than 1,500 years ago, Augustine put forth what came to be known as 5 arguments for the existence of God. And we're only going to talk about one of these tonight, but maybe I'll show it to you on the overhead. I'm not going to use this overhead very much because I know it's a long way from here to the back of the room. The cosmological argument, the effect of the universe's existence must have a suitable cause. Why would this be controversial 1,500 years after Augustine brought this up? Why such resistance to a definite beginning for the universe? Well, I think it is the cosmological argument, and perhaps we could divide it into three parts. Part one, everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Part two, supposing the universe began to exist. Part three, the logical conclusion, the universe must have a cause. And I think this could show you why there's some discomfort, has historically been some discomfort with this position. Robert Dicke, famed Princeton University physicist, stated that an infinitely old universe, which he dreamed of, would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. Perhaps the strongest statement I've seen on this topic is by Walter Nernst, the German physical chemist, discoverer of the third law of thermodynamics, Nobel Prize winner, and so on. His statement is strong. He made this statement: to deny the infinite duration of time would betray the very foundations of science. Strong statement. Some have gone so far as to suggest that the Big Bang Theory is a Christian conspiracy. Quoting from Simon Singh in his little book, The Big Bang, he made this statement: Fred Hoyle, more about him later, Fred Hoyle was equally scathing when it came to the Big Bang's association with religion, considering it a model built on Judeo-Christian foundations. Others have commented on this. Stephen Barr, distinguished university professor at the University of Delaware, has made this statement in an excellent book, quote, "The historical fact is that Christians believed in a beginning of time, while scientific materialists strongly preferred the idea of an ageless universe." In 1946, George Gamow, the Russian-born American physicist, proposed that the primeval fireball, or Big Bang, was an intense concentration of pure energy. It was the source of all the matter that now exists in the entire universe. The Big Bang Theory predicts that all the galaxies of the universe should be rushing away from each other at high speeds as a result of that initial Big Bang. The 1965 observation of the microwave background radiation by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson convinced most scientists of the validity of the Big Bang Theory of the origin of the universe. Further observations in 1992 and even within the last few years have moved the Big Bang Theory from a consensus view to one that is nearly unanimous among cosmologists. There was an origin to the universe, perhaps 13.7 billion years ago. Let me quote from my Berkeley colleague Joseph Silk on the evidence for the Big Bang Theory. Silk writes this in the magazine Science: "The hot Big Bang model is enormously successful. It provides the framework for understanding the expansion of the universe, the cosmic background radiation, and the primeval abundance of light elements, as well as a general picture of how the structure seen in the universe today was formed." And Penzias himself, 6 months before he received the Nobel Prize in Physics, made this rather controversial statement to the New York Times. Penzias said this, Penzias, discoverer of the microwave background radiation, he said this: "The best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Proverbs, the Psalms, the Bible as a whole." Here's a picture of Penzias and Wilson. They're getting pretty old now. They did their work in 1965, but there they are. They're both very distinguished administrators now. Can we see? Yeah, there they are. And that is a rather antiquated radio telescope, but that's the device in which they observe the microwave background radiation. When more recently, Penzias was asked, why was it that cosmologists were so affectionate in their embrace of the infinitely old universe? Why did Einstein and so many others dream of a universe that was infinitely old? And his statement is interesting. He says, well, some people are uncomfortable with the purposefully created world. To come up with things that contradict purpose, they tend to speculate about things they haven't seen. Fred Hoyle himself, writing on this topic, said this in his autobiography: explaining why he was so adamantly opposed to the Big Bang Theory, and he's so adamantly opposed to the notion of a beginning to the universe. Hoyle said this: "I have always thought it curious that while most scientists claim to eschew religion, it actually dominates their thoughts more than those of the clergy. The passionate frenzy with which the Big Bang cosmology is clutched to the corporate scientific bosom evidently arises from a deep-rooted attachment to the first page of Genesis, religious fundamentalism at its strongest." So here's a definition of fundamentalism for you, somebody who believes in the Big Bang Theory. There you go. Dennis Schaefer fits into our story because he was the thesis advisor of Stephen Hawking, Cambridge University. In my mind, the most brilliant of all those who were advocates of the steady-state theory of the universe, all those who believe the universe to be infinitely old. He changed his mind about 10 years ago, called a press conference, and explained his failures in the most humorous way. He said this: "The steady-state theory, which he had done more to popularize than any other scientist, steady-state theory has a sweep and beauty that for some unaccountable reason the architect of the universe appears to have overlooked." Stephen Hawking wrote in 1992 about what he described as the greatest scientific discovery of the century, the 20th century, the so-called Big Bang ripples observed by the Kobe satellite of NASA, Kobe Cosmic Background Explorer. And here's something that the New York Times wrote a front page article on this, which is unusual, and in big letters they described the story like this. They said, well, it doesn't appear at all yet. There it is. Well, it's getting there. Yeah, it said, it's like looking at God. Now, Smoot and I were classmates together at MIT, and candidly, very few of us thought that George Smoot was going to get the Nobel Prize, which he did 2 years ago. We knew him as being famous for something else, which you can read about in my book. It's at the back there somewhere. Well, I don't want to spoil the story. It's too good to say any more about George Smoot. But we didn't think he had a lot of promise, and we were wrong. We were wrong. Frederick Burnham, science historian, put the matter a bit more soberly, and I use the word advisedly with respect to Smoot's former life, in saying this in the Los Angeles Times just a week after the announcement of the Big Bang ripples. He said, "These findings, now available, make the idea that God created the universe a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the past 100 years. An intriguing statement. Let's go back to this question about the Big Bang being a Christian conspiracy. It's a popular topic. Jeffrey Burbidge is a famed astronomer, again, one of those who dreamed of a universe that was infinitely old, and still does. He still believes the universe is infinitely old. He's professor at the University of California at San Diego, and one of a very tiny number of scientists who reject the Kobe conclusions. And the way he rejects them is particularly spectacular. Burbidge said this. He says, "I discount these experiments as coming from, quote, the first Church of Christ of the Big Bang." George Smoot didn't like this at all. He appeared before the press the very next day and said, "There are 17 members of my research team, and I want to be very clear that not one of them has any relationship whatsoever to the first Church of Christ of the Big Bang." Burbidge favors the steady-state hypothesis, a view he says, an infinitely old universe, a view that he says supports Hinduism, not Christianity. Let me quote Smoot on this in his book, Wrinkles in Time, for which he received a $500,000 advance. There's money in this business. Smoot said this in Wrinkles in Time. "There's no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing." Big Bang ripples experiments have been, well, not replaced, they've been greatly extended by the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe. Charles Bennett, the prime mover in this research, Bennett, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he said this recently in Science Watch. He said, the Wilkinson probe, launched in 2001, so this is now, these experiments begin 9 years after the Big Bang ripples, has now mapped the temperature variations, or anisotropy, of the cosmic microwave background radiation over the full sky and with unprecedented accuracy and precision. And news articles on the Wilkinson probe, one from Bertram Schwarzschild in Physics Today just 2 years ago, the title of his paper, New Cosmic Microwave Background Results Strengthen the Case for an Inflationary Big Bang Cosmology. What this is all about is that the background temperature of the universe is something like 2.725 degrees absolute, degrees Kelvin, if you like. And, but it's not exactly the same. There are undulations of this background temperature. There are ripples. And these ripples are precisely predicted by the Big Bang theory. And that's the best the theory can do. The measure of, and we talked about this afternoon in the chemistry department, the best thing a theory can do is make predictions later confirmed by experiment. Adrian Cho, in his article in Science magazine entitled Long-Awaited Data Sharpens Picture of the Universe's Birth. Now, I have a couple little things in color here, and I know it's hard to see. This one is from Alan Guth. We'll mention Alan Guth in a few minutes. And this is his picture of the Big Bang. He calls it the inflating universe. And down at the bottom, he's got this tiny speck, which contains all the matter and energy in the entire universe. And it's not the size that appears on the screen. It's billions times billions times billions times billions times billions smaller than that. But in any case, here we are, the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. The so-called inflation, which we don't have to talk about, ends in 10 to the minus 35th seconds. That's not long. Atomic nuclei formed in 1 second. Chemistry begins. We're happy for that. 500,000 years, the universe cools, and here we are 13.7 billion years later. The universe keeps expanding. Where do these results take us? Where do these results take us? Well, let me make an attempt. Okay? By definition, time is that dimension in which cause and effect phenomena take place. No time, no cause and effect. If time's beginning is concurrent with the beginning of the universe, as the space-time theorem says, more about that in a little bit, then the cause of the universe must be some entity operating in a time dimension completely independent of and pre-existent to the time dimension of the cosmos. This conclusion is powerfully important to our understanding of who God is and who or what God is not. The Big Bang, should it be true, tells us that the Creator is transcendent, operating beyond the dimensional limits of the universe. It tells us that God is not the universe itself, nor is God contained within the universe. And some of you may say, well, I never thought that God was the universe or that God was contained within the universe. But, you know, I've been a dozen times to China to give lectures of this sort and 13 times to India. And, you know, something like half the population of the world, or at least 30%, believes one of those two things. So these are not uncommon views. Marcelo Gleiser has written a wonderful book called The Dancing Universe, in which he discusses these worldview ideas. He's a professor at Dartmouth University in New Hampshire. And he says, basically, there's one big question. Was there a beginning? He wraps this up in more complicated terminology. Was there a beginning? And there are two answers. I mean, this is a binary choice. It's either true or false. There was a beginning and there was not. And if you say yes, there are certain worldviews that you might be led to. And if you say no, there are certain others. So the ones on one side of this are true, and the ones on the other side are not true. Stephen Hawking has written a book called A Brief History of Time. My introducer claims to have read it. What can I say? I'll tell you when I first gave this lecture. This lecture has been evolving for quite a long time. I first gave this in Sydney, Australia. A dear friend of mine wrote to me, said, a lot of people here in Sydney have purchased this book, and some claim to have read it. The book is arguably the most unread book in the history of publishing. It's sold more than 20 million copies. And I teach a course on this book every year. to freshmen at the University of Georgia. So I have read this book 9 times. Professor, yeah, where is he? All right. Others have decided, so Stephen Hawking is a very wealthy man at this point. Others have tried to copy Hawking's success. Leon Lederman, one of them. Leon Lederman, Nobel Prize winner for particle physics, work done at outside Chicago. He has published a book with the best title of Lederman's book, The God Particle. And it's not a very good book. Don't race to tell him I said that, please. Please. This lecture is already infamous enough without adding that to it. Let me quote Leon Lederman, the first paragraph, because it's dynamite. It's fantastic. In fact, it's so good, it makes one suspicious of its origin. Leon Lederman, The God Particle, first paragraph. In the very beginning there was a void, a curious form of a vacuum, a nothingness containing no space, no time, no matter, no light, no sound. Yet the laws of nature were in place, and this curious vacuum held potential. A story logically begins at the beginning, but this story is about the universe, and unfortunately there are no data about the very beginning 13.7 billion years ago. None. Zero. We don't know anything about the universe until it reaches the mature age of a billionth of a trillionth of a second. That is some very short time after the creation in the Big Bang. When you read or hear anything about the birth of the universe, someone is making it up. We are in the realm of philosophy. Only God knows what happened at the very beginning. And Stephen Hawking has said much the same in The Brief History of Time. The actual point of creation lies outside the scope of the presently known laws of physics. And his North American counterpart, Alan Guth, we'll say a little bit about him later, makes this statement: the instant of creation remains unexplained. Here's my favorite picture of Stephen Hawking. I do want to show this. Let's see, I've got to get, yeah, I can't get all of him on there, but that's my favorite picture of him. And he's a couple years older than I am, so, you know, he's getting there. You know, this picture is only 3 years old. How old do you think he looked? This man in the football. I thought you all only had a basketball team. You got a football team too?
Yes, sir.
Well, good. Good. Hey, let me tell you all something. We would much rather play your football team than your basketball team. You know, we stole your basketball coach, and he was a complete bust. We had to let him go. Yeah, I don't know. You know, he's taking you guys to the Sweet 16 over and over again, and you know, we barely finished the season. Now, this young man in the Western Kentucky, how old do you think Stephen Hawking looks? He's 62 years old in that picture. How old does he look?
Young 50s, maybe.
Young 50, maybe even 40. Yeah, it's amazing. And he's had this, and Dr. Cobain alluded to this disease that he's had for so many years, and he looks like a young guy. All right. This lecture was once 1 solid hour, but it grew, and some things have to be skipped, and that's painful, but so be it. Stephen Hawking's most famous research, and I don't need that for a while, most famous research was carried out when he was a PhD student at Cambridge University. It was done with 2 others, Roger Penrose and George Ellis. All 3 of these people are very famous now. They demonstrated in the work they did together that every solution to the equations of general relativity guarantees the existence of a singular boundary, that is a beginning, for space and time in the past. This result is now known as the singularity theorem or the space-time theorem. That is his most famous work. Obviously, he went on to do work of his own: quantum evaporation of black holes, exploding black holes, Hawking radiation, and so on. Hawking is certainly the most famous, well, truthfully, he's the most famous scientist in the world, and the most famous scientist ever to not win the Nobel Prize. But he's in pretty good company, because there are a fair number of the rest of us who not yet won the Nobel Prize. Why? How can this be? How can it be that Hawking... Well, the answer is that there are special rules that the Swedish Royal Academy has for giving the Nobel Prize, and it's that an award-winning discovery must be supported by experiment or observation. And Hawking's work remains unproved. Mathematics of his theories is certainly beautiful and elegant, but nothing observed yet. The verification of Hawking radiation or some of his more theoretical proposals still seems quite a ways off. That said, let me be as clear as I could possibly be that Hawking is a great, great scientist, and even if he doesn't ever get the Nobel Prize, he will have had a more profound impact on the history of scientific thought than any of his contemporaries. I have to be careful here because I do want to get you out of here. I've told my sponsors that this is going to be finished in an hour, and I will try to do it. Hawking was diagnosed with this horrible disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, motor neurons disease. This disease has lots of different names. In 1962, and told that he had 2 years to live. That was 47 years ago. As far as I know, he's a medical miracle. I've had 3 friends that died of this disease. It's not contagious, but it does seem to come in clumps. And one lasted 2 years, one 3 years, and one 5 years after the diagnosis. It's a horrible thing. So his being alive is quite remarkable. What happened? How did he go from being this person with a death sentence to the greatest physicist of his generation? His biographers, Michael White and John Gribben, make this statement. They say, there is little doubt that Jane Wilde's appearance on the scene to become his wife was a major turning point in Stephen Hawking's life. The two of them began to see a lot more of one another, and a strong relationship developed. It was finding Jane Wilde that enabled him to break out of his depression and regenerate some belief in his life and work. For Hawking, his engagement to Jane Wilde was probably the most important thing that had ever happened to him. It changed his life, gave him something to live for, and made him determined to live. Without the help that Jane Wilde gave him, he almost certainly would not have been able to carry on or had the will to do so. Let me show you the wedding picture. I mean, it's so good. Look at this. Is it on there? Yeah, that's great. That's great. 1965, he's got a cane already, and of course, as Dr. Cobain said, he's been in a wheelchair for quite a number of years. Hawking himself says this in one of his books. He's written several books now, not just A Brief History of Time. Hawking says, but what really made a difference in my life was that I got engaged to a woman named Jane Wilde. That gave me something to live for. Now, Jane Hawking is a pretty impressive person in her own right. She has a PhD of her own in the medieval lyric poetry of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, if you all are expecting me to say anything else about that subject, you came to the wrong place. She has written a wonderful autobiography called Music to Move the Stars, 600 pages. I strongly recommend it. It even has some salacious events in it for those of you that are inclined that way. Jane Hawking, Jane Wilde Hawking is a Christian, and here's her statement published just a little while after the book was published. She said this: without my faith in God, I wouldn't have been able to live in this situation. I wouldn't have been able to marry Stephen in the first place because I wouldn't have had the optimism to carry me through, and I wouldn't be able to carry on with it. The reason for the tremendous popularity, or at least one of the reasons, of A Brief History of Time is that Hawking addresses those problems of meaning and purpose that concern all thinking people. The book overlaps with Christian belief, and it does so deliberately, but graciously and without rancor. It's an extremely important book, which is why I teach a course on it every year. There is this may surprise you, there's a main character in the book. There is a main character in the book, A Brief History of Time, and let me share with you where Stephen Hawking introduces the main character. He says this: it is difficult to discuss the beginning of the universe without mentioning the concept of God. My work on the origin of the universe is on the borderline between science and religion, but I try to stay on the scientific side of the border. It is quite possible that God acts in ways that cannot be described by scientific laws. And in an early response to, so God is the main character in the book. He's all over the place. And in a response to some comments about the book, Hawking said this. He said, "I thought I'd left the question of the existence of a supreme being completely open. It would be perfectly consistent with all we know to say that there was a being who was responsible for all the laws of physics." Asked once whether Hawking believed that science and Christianity were competing philosophies, said, "Of course not. If that were so, then Isaac Newton would never have discovered the law of gravity." Hawking, well knowing that virtually all of the great pioneers of the physical sciences were Christians. There are wonderful things in A Brief History of Time. I don't have time to share all of them, but I want to share two. Here's one. And I would describe this statement as intentionally ambiguous. Hawking says this: "Even if there's only one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equation and makes the universe to describe them?" What a challenging question, a question to help one develop a worldview. My very favorite thing in the book is when Hawking loves Augustine, or Augustine, depending on which side of the tracks you prefer. He loves Augustine, talks about him frequently, and this is what he talks about. This is a controversial issue even today. He talks about the idea that God might want to change his mind. And this is what Hawking says in A Brief History of Time. The idea that God might want to change his mind is an example of the fallacy pointed out by St. Augustine of imagining God as a being existing in time. Time is a property only of the universe that God created. Presumably, he knew what he intended when he set it up. Great sense of humor, and I completely agree with him in this. Stephen Hawking is amazingly active. Here's my favorite recent photo of him. He's in zero gravity here. For those of you that know much about zero gravity, this is at the Kennedy. Do I have him? Yeah, in Kennedy Space Center. He's in zero gravity for 30 seconds or so, and very much appears to be enjoying it. Alan Guth. Let's talk a little bit about Alan Guth. Alan Guth is the most famous cosmologist on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. He became a household word in a limited number of households with his paper in Nature, published in 1983, and it addresses, not too quickly here, it addresses a question. Once the steady state hypothesis died, the idea that the universe is infinitely old died, it wasn't, as we've talked about, the infinitely old universe was very popular with scientific materialists. They felt like they needed something else, and what replaced it, at least for about 20 years, was something we call the infinitely oscillating theory of the universe. The idea that, yes, there was a Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago, but before that, there was a big crunch preceded by a big, and we're just in the middle of an infinite number of big bangs and big crunches, so the universe really is infinitely old. And in fact, in Stephen Hawking's book, he refers many, many times to the big crunch, the time at which the universe will recollapse and come together. Well, that's not going to happen. Guth showed as early as 1983 that even if the universe contained enough mass to halt its current expansion, any ultimate collapse would result in a thud, not a bounce. Now, Guth is a professor at MIT, a university for whom I have great affection, since they gave me one of my degrees, even though I did not take 2 required courses. I told this to the dean about 15 years after I graduated, and he was not happy. Yeah, I did not take quantum electrodynamics, and did not take physical chemistry laboratory part 2. And it's too late for them to do anything about it. Anyway, so I encourage all of you that can get away with that to do it here. I'll tell you how it happened. The physical chemistry lab part 2, and I got ready to take this my second semester of my junior year, and the professor, Jim Kinsey, who was pretty terrifying at the time, but is now a very good friend of mine, I said to him, this lab is not well situated in the week. It's Friday afternoon. That's when I go down to see my girlfriend down near Cornell University, 350 miles away. How am I going to take this lab and get down there? He says, well, you're not. And so I just didn't take it. And a year later, I was still in love with her. And I didn't take it again because it was Friday afternoon. And, I did marry her. So, and we're still married. Here's Alan Guth. Some of you think the professors are very tidy in their offices, and here's Guth's office. It's quite something. This is also 3 years old, like my picture of Stephen Hawking, and I'm told that these piles are much higher now. And Guth claims he can find anything in his office in 5 minutes. Well, probably lies about other things too. In early 1998, the idea of a big crunch died. The idea of the universe recollapsing died. 2 observational research teams independently made what was at the time a startling announcement that the expansion of the universe is indeed accelerating. Saul Perlmutter at Berkeley, Brian Schmidt at the Australian National University. The prestigious journal Science named this the discovery of the year in Science for 1998. What can we say more generally about these ideas of worldview? Let me quote Alan Lightman. He has made what I think is probably the most scientific study of the spiritual views of great scientists. And his bottom line, he's an MIT professor, his book Origins, The Lives and Worlds of Modern Cosmologists, his bottom line is this. He says that contrary to popular myth, scientists appear to have the same range of attitudes about religious matters as does the general public. A shock to some people. My candidate for the greatest experimental scientist of the past 100 years is Charles Townes. I may be biased. Charles Townes is a friend of mine. He's the only friend of mine who's a serious candidate for being the most outstanding experimental scientist of the last 100 years. In 1958, he discovered the laser, a pretty significant discovery that's influenced every single person in the room here. Charlie Townes, almost a second Nobel Prize for his work on interstellar molecules, might still be coming. He's written an autobiography called Making Waves. That's supposed to be clever because lasers are a wave-like phenomenon. And in the last chapter of this book, it's called Spiritual Views from a Scientific Base. And he talks about his life as a member of the Christian community and says this: in my view, the question of origin, the things we've been talking about, seem always left unanswered if we explore from a scientific view alone. Thus, I believe there is a need for some religious or metaphysical explanation. I believe in the concept of God and in His existence. One of my teachers at Stanford University, where I did my graduate work, Arthur Schawlow, was interviewed in this Lightman book I just alluded to, and he makes an interesting statement that requires a little bit of explanation. Schawlow says this. He says, "We are fortunate to have the Bible, and especially the New Testament, which tells us so much about God in widely accessible human terms." Schawlow won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1981 for his work on laser spectroscopy, and I knew him well enough to tell you that he did believe, the core of his being, that everything he was learning from laser spectroscopy was telling him a little bit more about the nature of God. But he did not think what he was learning was widely accessible in human terms, which is the contrast he draws with the New Testament. George Ellis, one of these other 2 co-workers of Stephen Hawking, George Ellis from South Africa, been professor of applied mathematics at the University of Cape Town, a university I've lectured at several times. A remarkable person. Ellis is a very courageous man. Back in the bad old days in South Africa, the 1980s, he was very courageous in his consistent attacks on the apartheid system. And believe me, that was a dangerous thing to do. It's fortunate he was the most famous member of the faculty at the University of Cape Town, but even so, he was severely harassed. Extremely distinguished cosmologist and author with Stephen Hawking on Hawking's most important scientific book labeled The Large-Scale Structure of Space-Time. Ellis, a Christian, makes this statement recently: God's nature is revealed most perfectly in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth as recorded in the New Testament. John Polkinghorne, for many years the other professor of theoretical physics at Cambridge University. There were just two of them, and now they've both retired, both Hawking and Polkinghorne. Polkinghorne, again, pretty straightforward. He says, I take God very seriously indeed. I'm a Christian believer and believe that God exists and has made himself known in human terms in Jesus Christ. John Barrow, the person more responsible than any other for our understandings of the fine-tuning of the universe, received the Templeton Prize a couple of years ago. It's worth $1.5 million, so definitely worth a shot. His book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, discusses this amazing fine-tuning of the universe. When he received the Templeton Prize, he said this. He's a member of the Reformed Church in Cambridge. Said this: I certainly don't believe that there's some fundamental difference or conflict between a theistic Christian perspective on the world and the practice of science. The greatest living observational cosmologist, we've mostly been talking about theorists. Maybe that's my bias. I'm a theorist. Alan Sandage, Pasadena, California, greatest living observational cosmologist, called the grand old man of cosmology from the New York Times. Not a Nobel Prize, but he did get $500,000 from the Swedish Royal Academy for the Crawford Prize. And he, it's interesting, there are a number of quotes, but let's just go to one. He's asked in the Lightman book the famous question, can a person be a scientist and also be a Christian? And he says, yes, I am, and goes on to talk about that. But then he says why he became a Christian at the age of 50, which is a bit unusual. I became a Christian at age 28 in my 4th year as a young professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Sandage is asking, can a person be a scientist, also be a Christian? He says, yes, I am. And this is what he says. He says, now on the face of it, the right answer has got to be, he walked outside. He is in the Atacama Desert in Chile. They're the most wonderful astronomical devices in the world. And he looked up, and all these stars were out there, just overwhelmed with the beauty and the order of it all. That's not what he says. He says, biology made me do it. He says, the world is too complicated in all its parts and interconnections to be due to chance alone. I'm convinced that the existence of life, with all of its order in each of its organisms, is simply too well put together. Don Page, I've got to check time-wise. I'm okay. We're not done yet. Got 15 more minutes. Don Page, Stephen Hawking's closest personal friend and his most famous student. Interesting relationship. If you've seen the movie that my introducer described to you, Don Page is one of the central figures in the movie, and he is a bit nerdy. I will tell you. Well, let me show you what he looks like. If you don't believe he's nerdy, there he is. Now, hey, listen. Now, listen. We scientists are nerds, and we're proud of it. So I'm not. Listen. There's a steep pyramid about scientific abilities, and there's a steep pyramid for being good looking, and these two pyramids rarely overlap very much. So we are nerds and proud of it. So here he is on the 4 pages of full color in the Edmonton Journal, the largest newspaper. It's in northern Canada. Hawking went to be a postdoctoral fellow. Page went to be a postdoctoral fellow. He received his PhD from Caltech, went to be a postdoctoral fellow with Hawking, and lived in the Hawking household for 3 years between 1976 and 1979, because this is before Hawking was rich and famous, and his job in the household was to get Stephen up and going in the morning. And if you see the movie about Hawking, you'll learn all about that. Page's statement, which now appears in textbooks, is this. It's a famous statement. He says, I'm a conservative Christian in the sense of pretty much taking the Bible seriously for what it says. Of course, I know certain parts are not to be intended to be read literally, so I'm not precisely a literalist, but I try to believe in the meaning I think it is intended to have. I gave a lecture like this a few years ago at the University of Alberta. Don Page introduced me, and after we were done, it was noon, and I was getting pretty hungry. I'd skipped breakfast that day. That was a mistake. And he says to me, Schaefer, let's go into my office. I've got a few questions for you. Well, you know, that was over at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There was no lunch. I mean, he is an intense person. But I wanted to ask him a question. And my question to him, and I don't say I have the sequel to this, my question to him was, what is it you mean, Don, when you say you're not precisely a literalist in terms of believing in the Bible? He looked me right in the eye and said, Schaefer, you ought to understand that. Do you think that when the psalmist says that God shelters his children under his wings, the psalmist is trying to say that God is a big chicken? I said, well, that was not my interpretation previously, but, well, it's nice to broaden your views of things. You know, we have a big chicken in Atlanta. How many of y'all are from Atlanta? Come on, raise your hand. There are a few. And you know where the big chicken is, too. It's 60 feet tall in Marietta, Georgia, and everything in the city of Atlanta can be measured by the big chicken. It's got a beak that opens and closes. It rolls its eyes. It's an amazing thing. There is a big chicken, but it's not God. Well, I was there with Paige, and this one thing I just quoted is really famous, and I said, Don, you know, I may talk to a few audiences on this subject. Give me something good, something nobody's ever seen. And he says, I'll give you this. So he gives me this thing, and it's interesting. The background for this is what physicists call the beauty principle. The beauty principle is for those of you who are philosophers, this is Occam's razor. Okay? The beauty principle is that if we have two theories that equally well describe a set of experimental observations, the better theory is the simpler theory, the beauty principle. And this statement I've got from him takes off on that. Page says, if the universe basically is very simple, which all quantum cosmologists dream of, the theological implications of this would need to be worked out. Perhaps the mathematical simplicity of the universe is a reflection of the personal simplicity of the gospel message that God sent his son Jesus Christ to bridge the gap between himself and each of us who have rejected God or rejected what he wants for us by rebelling against his will and disobeying him. This is a message simple enough to be understood by quantum cosmologists or children. Now, my last example of these scientists, Chris Isham. Chris Isham, professor of theoretical physics at Imperial College London. Paul Davies, who writes very well about science to a general audience, has referred to Isham as, quote, Britain's greatest quantum gravity expert. That is no faint praise, because Stephen Hawking is British and does quantum gravity for a living. So this is his way of saying he thinks that Isham is even better than Hawking. We don't have to engage in that debate. We'll let others do that. Isham sponsored a lecture by me a couple of years ago at Imperial College. And my lecture was at 11 o'clock, and he said, Schaefer, let's go back to my office. I want to ask you a few questions. I'd had this experience with Don Page and gotten no lunch. And I said, well, okay. We went back, and he asked me questions for an hour, and then he took me to lunch. God bless him. So it wasn't as painful as the other experience. And I said to him, I said, Chris, give me something nobody's ever published before. Give me something good on this topic. He said this. He says, the God of Christianity is not only the ground of being, as Paul Tillich was wont to say, God is also incarnate. He continues, Isham continues, essential therein is the vision of the resurrection of Jesus Christ as the new creation out of the old order, and the profound notion of the redemption of time through the life and death of Jesus Christ. Now his last sentence, I want you to be very cautious that you don't jump to a conclusion, because it's possible. Isham's last sentence here, I think it will be rather a long time before theoretical physics has anything useful to add to that. You could conclude on that basis that he doesn't think theoretical physics is very important. You could not be farther from the truth. I know Chris Isham. He is passionate about theoretical physics. He has committed his entire professional life to theoretical. He's not saying that at all. He's just saying that what he's found in Jesus Christ is more important yet. Okay, my conclusions. The Big Bang represents an immensely powerful, yet carefully planned and controlled release of matter, energy, space, and time. All this is accomplished within the strict confines of very carefully fine-tuned physical constants and laws. The power and care this explosion reveals exceed human mental capacity by many orders of magnitude. Now, where do we go from here? Well, there are 700 or 800, 900 people here. I mean, y'all are going to go in different directions. I mean, there's no question. So before you do, let me tell you what I conclude about all this. I conclude, first of all, a creator must exist. The Big Bang ripples and the Wilkinson probe observations are clearly pointing to an ex nihilo creation event consistent with the first few verses of the book of Genesis. Second, this creator must have awesome power and wisdom. The quantity of material and the power resources within our universe are immense. The information or intricacy manifest in any part of the universe, and especially in a living organism, as Alan Sandage has well said, is beyond our ability to comprehend. And what we do see is only what God has shown us within the 4 dimensions of space and time that we inhabit. Third, this creator is loving. The simplicity, balance, order, elegance, and beauty seen throughout the universe demonstrate that God is loving rather than capricious. 4, and I've got 7 points and we're done. 4, this creator is just and requires justice, inward reflection, and outward investigation. Affirm that human beings have a conscience. The conscience reflects the reality of right and wrong and the necessity of obedience. 5th, each of us falls hopelessly short of this creator's standard. We incur God's displeasure when we violate any part of God's law in our actions, our words, and our thoughts. Benjamin Franklin writes about this in his autobiography, which is a classic book, and everyone here should read it. At about the age of 18, well, some of you all are 18, about the age of 18, he decided he was going to be good. He decided he was tired of doing bad things and he was going to be good. And he just wasn't going to do anything bad for the rest of his life. And didn't work out as well as he thought. And after a while he said, it's the time interval that's the problem. I'm going to be good for 1 year. He started off on that path and that didn't work either. He said, well, I'm just a little too ambitious. 1 month. Didn't work. A week, even a day, it wouldn't. And this is what Benjamin Franklin learned as an 18-year-old. He learned who can keep his or her thoughts and attitudes pure for even an hour. Each person falls short of his or her own standards, much less those of an all-holy God. 6th, because this creator is loving, wise, and powerful, he made a way to rescue us. When we come to a point of concern about our personal failings, as Benjamin Franklin did, we can begin to understand from the creation around us that God's love, wisdom, and power are sufficient to deliver us from an otherwise hopeless situation. 7th and last, if we trust our lives totally to the rescuer, Jesus Christ, we will be saved. The one and only path is to give up all human attempts to satisfy God's requirements and to put our trust solely in Jesus and in his means of redemption, namely his death on the cross. Thank you very much.
Considering the current reach of our scientific knowledge, the answer of how the universe began or what was the cause of the universe is not yet known. Whether the universe came from nothing, emerged from an existing universe, or has a creator has not been determined scientifically. So the most rational standpoint on the issue of the origin of the universe would have to be some sort of temporary agnosticism. To claim to know how the universe began precisely, who or what is responsible for the beginning of the universe, and their motives behind creating the universe is, to put it mildly, nothing less than an irrational assumption. So my question to Dr. Schaefer is, how does someone in a field of study such as your own, which demands such rational and logical thinking make such an assumption?
Well, we obviously don't agree, but I appreciate your comments and your question. I think the scientific evidence that the universe was created out of nothing is compelling. And does it come to proof? No, it does not. This is not scientific proof, but I think it is scientific evidence which is compelling to those who are willing to consider the scientific facts.
We have a person back here.
Yes, my question is also based in the empirical aspect of your profession. You talked earlier about like biblical literal, like taking it literally. Do you, as a scientist, take the entire Bible literally outside of metaphors? Like, do you believe in talking snakes and things of this sort?
Well, you know, to what degree am I a biblical literalist? I think I'm pretty much on the same page with Don Page. I think that quite a number of passages in the Bible are intended to be taken figuratively. That is what Page was getting at when he said, we think God is a big chicken. So my feeling is that the best understanding of the Bible should be governed by the author's original intent. When the intention is clearly figurative, it ought to be understood that way. When it's clearly literal, it ought to be understood in that way. So that's my take on that. So I'm, like Don Page, I'm not precisely a literalist.
Brooke, do you have someone?
Yes, I came tonight expecting a little bit more science and just got a little bit more philosophy than I anticipated. But towards the end of your discussion, you seem to insinuate more towards the Creator being Jesus Christ, as opposed to, say, Vishnu or the Islamic God, which is apparently the same. You do not mention Odin or, example Cronus. I want to know specifically what scientific evidence you have to pinpoint one specific cosmic deity over another. Because you just seem to want to elaborate on the Christian, the biblical interpretation, and there's no science involved. It's just more of a reading of a book more than it is figuring out what nature's actual intentions are.
Schaefer?
Well, thank you. It's a good question. Let me say, first of all, that I came to Bowling Green to make friends, not enemies. So if you came to hear me criticize any other religions, you came to the wrong place. Now, what about the evidence for the Christian faith?
In any way insinuating that you were mocking other gods at all. I was more curious about scientific reasoning behind Yahweh or Jesus or the Holy Spirit, as opposed to, for example, Vishnu or Thor or Odin or Cronus.
Well, if you give me a chance, I'm trying to get there. Science comes in two rather different varieties. There is what I might call real-time science, which is what I do for a living. That is to say, we do theory, we do experiments, and the hallmark of real-time science is the word reproducibility. An experiment is carried out here at Western Kentucky University. Turns out to be very important. Almost immediately upon publication of that experiment, other scientists in the world will try to reproduce it. A single experiment is not considered irrefutable. It has to be reproduced by others. This is what we call real-time science, the hallmark reproducibility. But there's another kind, there are a lot of things in science that aren't reproducible. The Big Bang is not reproducible. We certainly wanted our neighborhood to be reproduced. The extinction of the dinosaurs 70 million years ago is not reproducible. So there are these aspects of science that Stephen Gould used to like to call historical science, which includes anthropology and other things. Is it not fair to consider historical evidence when we are asking ultimate questions? I've already said that I think the evidence for the existence of God is compelling, scientific evidence, but what does this have to do with Jesus is the question that was asked, and I think the answer is history. I remember, and I was not a Christian for many, many years. I remember Easter Sunday, 1969. I went to church, and which we did occasionally, and I mean, it was considered a sociable thing to do, especially on Easter and Christmas. In fact, some of us referred to as the C&E group, Christmas and Easter. That's when we would appear in church. I appeared in church on Easter Sunday, and I will remember to my dying day what John Burns was an Englishman. He was the minister, and he was obviously, this was a sermon unlike anyone I ever heard before. He was obviously a very brilliant guy, and he started out with words I will never forget. He said, "This whole business of Christianity is a sham unless Jesus rose physically from the dead." Now, I was so taken by that first sentence, I didn't pay much attention to the rest of the sermon, I have to admit. But I took it home with me, and well, actually, I went up and talked to him. I said, that was an interesting first sentence. And he said, "You didn't like the rest of the sermon?" I said, "Well, I can't remember too much of it. It was the first sentence that grabbed my attention." I said, "You really believe that?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I do." And he said, "Do you?" And I said, "Well, I never really thought about it." And he said, "Well, why don't you?" And he suggested a bunch of books that I ought to read, and I didn't read them. But I went down the hall the next morning, Monday morning, to see my friend Dave Hornby, who was a renowned atheist in the chemistry department at Stanford. And I said, "Dave, you're not going to believe this, but I heard somebody really smart yesterday say that Jesus had risen physically from the dead." And he said, "Where did you hear that?" I said, "Well, I was at church." And he said, "Well, that was your first mistake." And then he spun out this, and I said, "Well, okay, lay it on me, Dave. What's the contrary evidence?" And so he laid it on me. He said, "It's all in this book. Only 200 pages long. It's called The Passover Plot." Some of you little gray in the hair have probably read this book, and it was a page turner. I mean, I'm going through this. I mean, it's just like a Tom Clancy novel, and just going through, and basically it starts out in kind of a conventional way. It says that Jesus was whipped, scourged with a whip with pieces of bone and metal tied to the end of it to a degree which in and of itself killed perhaps 50% of the people on whom this punishment was inflicted. He was forced to carry a cross up the hill. Halfway on the way, he collapsed, a man from North Africa.
There's no science. You're not answering.
One question at a time, please.
Dr. Schaefer has
He's
the
not
floor, and you
answering
can
the
ask your
question.
question. Dr. Schaefer has the floor.
Hands. I'm not making him look like anything. He is not answering my question. I want scientific evidence, or I don't want to hear anything. You can just tell me you don't know, and we can move along. But this is something that you're supposed to answer. Otherwise, there's no science involved. There has to be a falsifiable claim.
Dr. Schaefer is trying to answer that question, and I respectfully ask you to allow him to finish his answer. You came here to ask him a question, so please give your answer.
Okay, let me go back just a second and say that science comes in two varieties: observational, real-time science, and historical science. Is it not fair to ask the question about ultimate things, spiritual things, both from a scientific perspective and from a historical perspective? I've shared with you how, in my mind, the scientific evidence for the existence of God is compelling, and many great scientists have agreed with me. Essentially, all the pioneers of modern physical science, and many of the great ones today. And then, how do we get to Jesus? The answer to that is through history. So, just to go back briefly to this Passover plot, Jesus is crucified. He's impaled with a large spear, and then in the Passover plot, they say that in the absence of modern medicine, this man just felt terrific in a couple of days. He was put in a cool cave, and he got out of it and just knocked the socks off of his best friend, and he deceived his best friends into thinking that he had actually been alive all the time, or risen from the dead. And you know, I looked at this, and you know, was he alive all the time with all these things happening? I say, you know, as a scientist, I can put a probability on that event, and the probability is 0.0000. By the time you get to breakfast tomorrow morning saying zeros, you can put a 1 there. Basically no probability at all. And I began to study these historical evidences for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and can't say that it happened overnight. It took several years, and I became convinced that it's not only true, but it's one of the best attested facts in all of ancient history. Did I become a Christian the very next day? No, I didn't. It took about another year. Why? Well, because there were some issues in my life. What are issues? My daughter Rebecca she's always talking about issues, and I asked her, Rebecca, what are issues? I said, well, issues, Dad, are some problems I've got that you're not going to hear about. So I had some issues in my life, and about a year later I received Jesus Christ into my life, and it's made all the difference to me.
I'd like to point out that we are going to have a conversation. Conversation cafe down in the lobby in just a few minutes. At that cafe there will be coffee, juice, snacks, and so forth. And some of the questions which we simply don't have time to answer in great length here tonight in this assembly can certainly go further at that time. I do want to move to a different question. Randy?
First of all, thanks for coming. Unfortunately, my question is maybe fortunately, very similar to the one that's just asked. I'm wondering, scientifically speaking, why is it that if I'm not a Christian, am I in the wrong? And why is it that if someone is on the other side of the world has never heard the message of Christ, are they inherently flawed and wrong? And why is there only one path here? Are they different really in the end? Don't they all just represent love?
Well, it's a good question, and there are other ways to ask this question. One of the most creative ways to ask this question that I've heard is, why is the distribution of Christianity, although 1 in 3 human beings claims to be at least nominally Christian, why is the distribution of Christianity so uneven geographically? This is a different way, I think, of saying the same question. And, my simple response to that is that the distribution of the understanding of calculus geographically is quite uneven as well. Truth is not measured by its distribution. On the other hand, let me tell you that I was in China the week before last, and there are now 120 million Christians in China. There will be more Christians in China in 10 years than in any other country in the world. So wonderful things are happening. What were Jesus' last instructions to his closest friends? Go out and share this message with all people, make them disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. So I've tried to do a little bit of that in my life, and I would encourage all of you to try to similarly follow his instructions.
Okay, Mark?
I was just wondering, but there are a lot of different interpretations and philosophies about Jesus and the Christian faith, and I was just wondering if there was a certain denomination or philosophy that you related to.
Well, I believe in the ice cream theory of denominations. Not everybody here knows about the ice cream theory of denominations, but this is my take on it, is that to me, well, I like ice cream. Not everybody here is going to agree with that. I like ice cream. In fact, I like almost every flavor of ice cream. I mean, I have a favorite, Oregon Mountain Blackberry. That is my favorite. That's my favorite ice cream. But coffee ice cream, chocolate chip, Rocky Road, Moose Tracks, you name it. I like it all. Now, yeah, I have a particular flavor I like better, but I like it all, and so I think different denominations are largely variations on the theme. That's why I'm so appreciative of all these different student groups on campus coming together to sponsor this lecture. Bottom line is, I love y'all.
Brooke?
I have a question about, have you ever made another resources about other religions and evidence scientists like Quran they have noticed many scientists evidence about many things like such as planet and like I have example of that they say that the baby in his first time when he starts born, I don't know how to say it in English because I still study in English, but when the woman she gets pregnant and the small piece of the baby called made with class A. I don't know, class A or clap A, something, but it is natural and there is many evidence in other religions. And some scientists, they cover Islam just because they saw that there is many things that only Quran that they mention it and no other religions they mention it. I don't know.
Okay, well, I am familiar with the Quran, and I encourage those of you who are not to do so. I've given lectures on this topic in Sarajevo, Bosnia, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, in Turkey, and other Islamic places. So, and I always talk to people in these places, so I am somewhat familiar with these things, I think. Yeah.
Come back up here.
Dr. Schaefer, I was wondering, how old do you think the universe is, and how would you rectify the BC to AD time frame?
Well, my view is the universe is 13.7 billion years old, and you all don't have to agree with me on this. You know, listen, my wife doesn't agree with me on this, and we've been married for 42 years. It's been wonderful. You know, I'll be coming home tomorrow night, driving back 7 hours back, and I hope my wife will be anxious to see me. And I guarantee you, the first thing she's going to ask me about is not the age of the universe. She is convinced the universe is less than 10,000 years old. And obviously, I'm a very skillful debater because I've made no progress on this at all over the years. So I don't view this as something to divide Christians. I do have my view, you know, so I think, you know, BC is most everything. BC is, you know, if the age of the universe is 13.7 billion years old, then BC is 13.6999999 billion years.
Mark, and we're not going to be able to take very many more questions, so let's keep our questions as brief as possible. Mark?
Dr. Schaefer, my name's Johnny, and this is Rachel. We're from Kim 220, Rochelle, I'm sorry, I totally said your name wrong. But we're from the Kim 222 here, and we just wanted to first say thank you for coming out and standing up for your faith, and I appreciate that. And the one question I had was, I just want to know, do you think you would have accomplished as much if you weren't a Christian, and if you didn't believe in God? Do you think that inspired you a whole lot?
That's a good question, and the answer, candidly, is unknowable. But I think being a Christian does give you additional motivation to be a scientist. I was actually interviewed on this topic by U.S. News way back in 1991, and they actually got it right in their cover story. And I can't exactly remember what they wrote, but they wrote about what I told them, and what it was is that the joy I have in my science is in those occasional moments when we discover something new and say, hey, that's how God did it. So I want to understand a little bit better a small corner of God's universe, and I think that motivation is valuable.
I'm going to allow one more question, and then we're going to give some things away. Back here to Brooke.
Yes, Dr. Schaefer. Throughout history, we can see how religion has been the cause of war and hatred through different cultures and different nations. Apart from God and actual spirituality, do you think the world would be better off without the act of religion?
Well, like I said, I'm not going to comment on other religions because I don't do that. If you're looking for somebody to do that, you have to look farther. But I think that one can objectively make a very strong case for the benefits of the example of Jesus and the Christian faith. Hospitals throughout the world have been started by Christians. I mean, I travel all over the world, and hospitals are named St. X, where X is you take your choice all over the place. Educational institutions, colleges have the same Christian names all over the world. One can point to things like the Red Cross for the alleviation of suffering. Even the Salvation Army today still at it after all these years. So I think the influence of the Christian faith in the world has been a profound one. The notion of love, as it is explicitly spelled out by Jesus, has been very important. Richard Feynman, who actually was an atheist, said that there are two great ideas that have come forward in the last 10,000 years. One, the idea of science, and one, the Christian idea of love.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.